Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Computer Access Comparison. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Helena Vuori. I'm a Sales and Customer Support Manager here at Kuha. And for those who don't know Kuha yet, we manufacture computer access devices, and our most famous products are the Kuha Zone or gyroscopic head mice. I'm very pleased to be joined by Adam Wade from Smartbox Assistive Technology. So he's our expert today. Adam, thank you for taking the time to come and talk about computer access with us.
You're welcome.
Adam, would you like to say a few words about yourself and Smartbox?
I can do that. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Adam Waits. Thanks for the introduction, Hannah. I'm from Smartbox Assistive Technology. We're based in the UK, in the middle of the UK. My background, started my career as a teacher, both primary and secondary age children, increasingly then with special needs and special education. And inevitably, these things happen. I fell into assistive technology and the application of assistive technology with children and young people. And I suppose I've then spent the last, 25 years in assistive technology, and the last 15 or 16 years with Smartbox in the UK. And we provide grid software, which hopefully some of you will have heard of. But in the UK, but also a range of AAC, so communication solution and computer access solutions as well. You've gone again, Hannah, just so you know. That's better. It might just be a volume thing, that when you speak at a certain volume, the microphone picks up, but you're back now.
I just hold the microphone a bit closer to my mouth. I don't know.
It's working anyway.
Okay. So, my colleague will bring me a book. Place the microphone on. So, okay. So, today we'll be covering various aspects of alternative computer access devices. And by the way, we are recording this session, so we'll provide a link at some point after the webinar. And if you have any questions, one of my colleagues is monitoring the chat box, so you can type your questions there. We'll answer all the questions after the discussion, or you can just speak up if you like. Okay, so let's start with the topic today. So Adam, can you first tell us about the types of computer access devices that Smartbox provides? What's the range?
Sure. Yeah. So the range, we cover a range of the more complex computer access solutions, but really what our main aim is to ensure that those that need assistive technology have an access method that they can use. So that might typically look like, of course, touch access, which is the most common form of access that we can all use these days. So we might well be working with some users who need touch. We then would move on to alternative access. So we might be thinking about key guards for touch access. We might be thinking about joysticks. We absolutely might be thinking about head mice. We would think about and work with a range of eye gaze cameras as well, and switches. And what we try to make sure we're doing Smartbox is not necessarily just offering one solution or one type of head mouse or one type of eye gaze camera, but recognize that one size doesn't fit all. And so we spend some time trying to find the right solution for someone. I should say that probably at the center of everything we do is our software, because that's the software that we make and works with all those different access methods that I've mentioned. So that software, as I mentioned earlier, is Grid. So I suppose two programs there. There's Grid 3, which will work on a Windows-based platform or a laptop, and then there's Grid for iPad, which will work on iPad. Yeah.
What about the typical user? So who would be the typical user of each access method? Are there some
Yeah.
like specific conditions and diagnoses?
Absolutely. So if I think about more complex access, and by more complex access, I'm thinking about alternative access, whether that's switch, head tracking, joysticks, that sort of thing. So we'll work with a range of different users with different conditions. We work with a lot of users who have cerebral palsy, who might well use, actually, there's such a wide range with cerebral palsy. They might use a whole range of different access methods, but typically someone with cerebral palsy might be using eye gaze. They might be using touch with a key guard, remembering they'll often have a gross motor difficulty, but they also will, depending on things like head control, they might well be using a head tracker, a head mouse, perhaps, and indeed switches. And those switches might be positioned and used with different parts of their body, whether that be a hand, a foot, a head, for example. And then for other users, so if I'm thinking about eye gaze as an access solution, we might be working with users, for example, who are maybe have motor neurone disease or ALS. We might have users again who have cerebral palsy, as I said, multiple sclerosis, so MS. Yes, so a whole different type of users. I should also say that before, or as well as alternative access, we're often working with users who have autism or on the autistic spectrum, working with touch perhaps, Angelman syndromes, Rett syndrome. So the whole, it's a really wide range. I mean, where do you start? It's finding a solution for someone who might otherwise struggle with standard computer access, and who may need alternative support for things like speech.
Of course, we would be interested in learning more about the typical users of the Kuha Zono mice specifically.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Funny that. Funny that you might be interested in that. So Kuha Zono mouse and mice options. I think typically, and I would broaden that out to be somebody who might be able to use perhaps a head tracker. We'll talk about when it might be a Zono rather than something else as well in a moment, I'm sure. But typically those users, we might meet users who, for example, have had an injury, might have had a spinal injury, might have suffered some form of paralysis, where they no longer have control or good control of their hands, and lower body, and perhaps but still have good neck and head control. And that's a classic case of someone who does really well with a head tracker. They've got good control, and then they then find head mice very accurate. But absolutely, I've worked with users with cerebral palsy who surprise me that they use a head tracker as well as they do, because you think they haven't got the head control. They have lots of involuntary, spasmodic head control sometimes, but actually find a head mouse their best access method. So in some cases that's true. We might see users with Parkinson's, for example. Absolutely. Some users with motor neurone disease may well find head tracker works well for all or some of their journey as their condition changes. I mentioned things like muscular dystrophy is a classic case where young people with muscular dystrophy find a head tracker might work really well, where using their hands they have very good fine motor control but struggle with reach and so on. The other area of interest often is, I would say, I can't say that we at Smartbox see a great deal of people who suffer from things like workplace injuries. I'm thinking about things like RSI or carpal tunnel syndrome, those sort of ergonomic conditions where people may have had an overuse injury, and that might be related to their keyboard or mouse use, and might well then use head trackers. I could certainly work with a few in the past who have, less so probably now, but absolutely that fits the bill in that area where they're trying to relieve their use of traditional methods of using a keyboard and mouse. Gone again, Hannah?
Sorry?
Oh, you're back. You've disappeared.
Okay, good. So And then to the access device selection process. So when you need to select an access device or devices for a user, so
Yeah.
how do you proceed? What's the assessment process like?
Oh goodness. Yeah. You'd like to think that every assessment is the same, but it never is. So one size fits one, but there is a logical process that you might go through. So I think the first thing in terms of deciding what someone might work well with, before you even are sat down next to the client or next to the potential user, is you've done a bit of discussion and talking and finding out what they find difficult and what they like to do and what they are able to do as well. So you might have discovered that they have limitations of hand movement, but they have really good head control, that they struggle with head control, but they can do a reliable movement of their foot or their elbow or their arm or whatever it might be. So a bit of pre-trial discussion and finding out is absolutely something. Key, of course, is observation. So when you first meet someone, before you even putting any equipment in front of them, just talking and watching them. So I'm often talking to a client, but watching how they work with the things around them. I think that when I'm thinking about selecting a particular access method, you observe how good someone's fine or gross motor difficulty is. And we're often working with those who cannot use a standard mouse or cannot use a keyboard. But we might start with what we're thinking about is the access method, which is going to be in a way the simplest for them to manage over the long term. And not just that user, but sometimes their support network around them as well. So if someone has got good touch access, I'm going to give them a touch access device because, unless we're going to do some further injury to something like an ergonomic injury, that would be the logical thing to do. It's the most mainstream form of access. It's everywhere. We're using our phones, we're using tablets all the time with touch. But if I'm observing someone and they are struggling to hit small targets, they're struggling to grasp or reach something, a pen on the desk, for example, then I might need to think about interventions. And those interventions might start with providing some sort of help with touch. And that might be a setting on the computer, whether it be Windows or iOS, before we think about things like plastic or overlay key guards. And you go from there. It's about trial, observation, elimination of solutions is almost as important as getting to the right solution. So you make good guesstimates about where to start, but I'm usually looking for the least complex solution first. I have to consider whether what someone's needs and wants are. So if they're a very, very able computer user and they want to work quickly, and I've got to choose between perhaps using switch scanning and using eye gaze, and they can do both, well, logically, I'm probably going to go down the eye gaze route because it's going to give them speed, much more than switch access. But if someone is struggling with accuracy and reliability is absolutely key to them, then another access method like switch scanning might be something to consider. But yeah, there's lots of things to consider there, but hopefully that's a flavour of how we go about it.
We move on to the pros and cons of each type of access device. So, and what would be the essential things that we should consider, in your opinion?
Okay. So pros and cons of different access solutions. I think what I'll start with, I'm going to start thinking about eye gaze, because in the last 15 or certainly in the last 10 years or so, there has tended to be a natural assumption that if someone's got physical difficulties managing a computer, oh, let's give them an eye gaze solution. It's not always the right answer. Sometimes you can learn a lot about someone with eye gaze, but then settle on a different access method. But if I think about eye gaze for a moment, so I sometimes come back to thinking about how we develop as humans and as young children, young and babies, and how they naturally develop their physical control. So when we are working with a very young toddler, the natural thing for that toddler to do, and by the way, that toddler might be developing perfectly normally, the natural thing for them to do is look at that what they want and reach for what they want. And that's sometimes why I talk about looking, and touching being two of the most natural human interfaces or sensory approaches that someone's going to make. So eye gaze on one level can be a very natural thing to do. You look at what you're interested in. So when we first start with somebody who's very young, perhaps or cognitively is working at an early level, then eye gaze can be a good starting point, because you see where someone is looking immediately. It's very instant. And so you get that instant feedback. So that's nice. However, as you move on with eye gaze, beyond simply looking at something to make something happen, and you need to start thinking about, for example, selecting something on the screen, not just scanning across different things and getting random selections. So you might be moving to something with a communication board on it. You might be using a grid with different symbols or words or text on it. You might later on be wanting to use your computer for graphic design or spreadsheets, whatever it might be. And you then there's a whole host of things you need to consider. And eye tracking becomes very much more challenging at that point. You need to think about some quite high cognitive load at that point. So I think you need to think about compensation, because eye tracking is hard to be really accurate with. So you've got to learn that although the track point is slightly above the target you might be looking at, because it's just not quite accurate enough, you've got to learn to compensate to look slightly lower, for example. You also have to learn to do some unnatural things, like look long enough at something to make something happen. And that's quite an unnatural thing to do. So head tracking, you have a bit more time to plan your movements. It can be a bit slower initially. I should say as well, I've always felt that I've talked a little bit about eye gaze there being a natural human interface, and I think it is. Head tracking, there is something you're doing. You're moving your head to make a mouse cursor move on the screen. I should say head, it's usually the head. You're moving your head to make a mouse move on the screen to make something else happen. So there is more cognitive load in that respect. It's not an immediate link between what you do here and what you do on the screen. There's something in between, which is the mouse cursor, that you have to understand you're moving the mouse cursor to make something happen. So in that respect, there's a bit more to think about and a bit more to get used to and a bit more to work on. But as you move forward, you have a bit more control, and you certainly have greater accuracy potentially. One of the things that's interesting when you're comparing head tracking and eye gaze is this idea of what my colleague calls smooth pursuit. So when you are using eye gaze, if you were just staring at the screen and there's nothing on the screen, or staring at a space, daydreaming if you like, and trying to move your eye across your field of view, but there was no stimuli there was nothing there to actually follow, it's impossible for the eyes to do that smoothly. It moves in a jerky movement. They're almost like saccades. It's a jerk, until you've got something to follow. If you put something on the screen, or you're following a tennis ball in a tennis match, then your eyes can smoothly follow that object. Now, if you're a graphic artist, not being able to do smooth pursuit with your eyes is a challenge, because you might be painting onto a blank canvas or drawing onto a blank canvas, and that becomes very challenging. But with head tracking, of course, you could absolutely do that. So that's one key difference to think about, is you can get nice fluid movements with head tracking that you might not be able to do with eye gaze, particularly without any stimuli on the screen if you're working in blank areas. So graphic artists and gamers will often choose a head tracker for those reasons. It gives them a bit more control than it will over eye gaze. Moving away quickly and just briefly away from eye tracking and head tracking, again, why would you choose different access methods for different folks? It really just depends upon their needs and wants. Key often is reliability. It's no good giving someone a head tracker or eye gaze if they're only accurate with it 60% of the time. They need to be accurate with it 90+%, 95% of the time, if not 100% of the time, for it to be motivating, for it to be a reliable solution. If you ever tried to use voice recognition, say 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when it was perhaps 90% accurate, it quickly became something you didn't want to do. Whereas today, actually, when it's in the high 90s, it becomes much more motivating and a much more realistic option. So thinking there about switch access scanning, which you might use with an on-screen keyboard solution like Grid to control another application or to control your communication device, that can be slow, but it can be very, very reliable. And for that reason, some users will choose that. They feel they have the time to think and plan, particularly if they're using more than one switch to control their movement. It is slower, but they're in control. I think those are three of the more complex access methods. If we can introduce something that's more mouse-like, like a joystick, that feels more familiar. Those around them can support that more effectively and teach that skill, and again, can give more control. Is that kind of answering your question, Hannah?
Definitely.
Good, okay.
And when would you recommend a gyro mouse, like Kuha Zono, for example? So
yeah, gyro mouse, yes. So I think we're talking about head trackers. So Kuha Zono is one type of head mouse with gyroscopic control inside, and either radio or Bluetooth link. The other traditional form of head tracker tends to use infrared sensors, and you typically would see someone using a silver dot on their head to tell those sensors where that head is moving. So a couple of things, a couple of areas I'd think about. One would be if you're working in very hot environments, the really simple fact is sometimes those silver dots lose their stickiness and fall off. So you need to think about that. There are ways around that. So if I was Henna using that, I might wrap the silver dot around the bridge of my glasses, for example, and it's unlikely then to be removed. I might wear a baseball cap with a silver strip on it. But thinking about whether someone even wants to be wearing a silver dot or whether it's going to fall off is something to think about. The gyro mouse has a distinct advantage there that you're not wearing something there. You are, of course, usually wearing something here, and that has to be considered as well. Although the new edition of the Kuha X is much lighter, and so that might work really well for somebody. The other thing to think about is where you're using that in terms of indoors or outdoors. So I talked about the silver dot sort of infrared solution. That's not going to work very well outdoors. There's an awful lot of ambient infrared interference that's going to occur outdoors, and it's unlikely to work well. Whereas a gyro mouse like Kuha works seamlessly whether you're indoors or outdoors, and that's nice. I think line of sight, you don't need line of sight with a gyro mouse. With a silver dot, I have to be, in roughly the right place in front of my laptop to use it. So if I've got somebody, for example, who's lying in bed and projecting their laptop onto a 60-inch TV mounted on the wall, gyro mouse is going to be fine, and I've done that. Whereas something with a silver dot is not really the solution that's going to work as well. I think the other thing to think about when I think about some of the solutions that we provide at SmartBot, so we provide both gyro mouse in the form of Kuha. We also provide a nano head mouse, which is a type of infrared traditional tracker. One of the advantages of using those gyro mouse can be the additional software features that you get. So I really like when you first start with a head mouse, just being able to plug it in and go, and you can do that with both Kuha and and head mouse. That's nice for some environments. That's great. Plug and play, brilliant. And cross-platform with QHAR is a real plus as well. But I might want to make use of some of the gestures that are available in QHAR. So I might have somebody who's got that proficiency and wants that control to be able to seamlessly scroll down a PDF or web page, for example, that they want to be able to pause or recenter their head mouse whenever they want. And so some of those extra features might be helpful as well, along with some of the Dwell software. So that idea of when you use QHAR Dwell mouse software with the gyro mouse, wherever you stop, you get the options to have your operations available all around your cursor position, and those operations can be changed by the user. So I liked that. I think one last thing on gyro mouse to consider is remembering that you don't necessarily have to wear it on the head. And I've used QHARs in the past where actually they've got really great wrist control or foot control, and we've attached the QHAR Zone 02 or the old QHAR Zone 1 at that point and told the software, by the way, I'm not using it on the head anymore. I've mounted it in a different part of the body, and they've got great control because it's just working on tilt and gyroscopic features, and it's not looking for a silver dot, and it works beautifully. So that's another reason why I might go down that route. Lost? Oh, you're back.
Can you hear me now?
Can hear you now.
So the last thing we wanted to talk about was medical device regulations. So we would be interested in hearing about medical device regulations or any other certification requirements that apply to access devices in the UK. So are there such requirements on the access devices that you sell to your customers? And for example, is it possible to sell access devices that are not UKCA marked medical devices?
Yes. So I guess my answer to this would be it's the expectation that they are medical devices. So either CE or UKCA. I still can't get my head around saying UKCA, but anyway, that's another conversation. But I think it's probably the expectation rather than the requirement is how I would regard it. Without it, wouldn't stop someone being able to use that device if it was the right solution for them. But there is an expectation that we want those regulations, but it's not an absolute requirement. It's more of a recommendation that be the case. And to be fair, I think in most instances we see that, certainly from QHAR and the other things in our range. Most of them have those necessary regulations. But for an example, I know that our Nano head mouse has American, US regulation certification, but doesn't necessarily have CE regulation. But we still provide it and sell a few of those. So and they're used amongst our UK assessment centres quite happily. So yeah, expectation rather than absolute requirement is what I would say.
Okay, so we have spent 30 minutes and I think we have pretty much covered the agenda. Unless there's anything else you would like us to know, Adam?
No, I think I've probably spoken long enough.
So thank you so much, Adam. It's been very interesting. So thank you so much for coming. And do we have any questions? No.
I haven't checked the chat or anything. Nope. Good.
I have one.
Hello, everyone. What?
Can you hear me? Manfred is speaking.
Yes, we can hear you, Manfred.
Okay, I have one remark concerning the medical device regulation. I think you're right if it's in the private area, but if you go to institutional area, especially in Germany or Austria, they ask for certifications now because they are also triggered. MDR is very important, and
Yeah.
they look for certifications.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as you know, there are a lot of even Evernet has 45 devices already certified according to the medical device regulation. I was surprised.
Yeah, and I think really there, Manfred, I was referring to the UK picture in particular, and I know it's different, and I would say it's strengthening in the UK just as you're seeing in Germany as well. So it's becoming increasingly important, but it's not yet, as far as I'm aware, with some of our key assessment centres, they're not refusing to buy devices that haven't got those certificates. It just so happens that many of our devices do, but I mentioned Nano as being something that I know hasn't got all that full certification, and yet it's being purchased by those institutions in the UK.
Further questions? I think we can then say thank you to everyone for joining us today. I hope you had a good time. I'm sure you did. We're such an expert here. So thank you, and see you again next time.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Hannah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.